Thank you very much for the three of you to agree to come to the panel. Thank you to everyone here watching the panel right now. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. We started some of the discussion via email, and I already am very interested in what everybody has to say. I just want to give a quick introduction of who the speakers are. Then they will themselves introduce themselves and give a little background on their opinions about this topic. After that, I will give a couple of questions, and then I will open it up for the audience to ask them anything you want related to this topic. So today we have Dr. Luis Enrique Sucar. Dr. Sucar is a senior research scientist at the Instituto Nacional de Astrofísica, Óptica y Electrónica in Mexico. He's also a recipient of the National Science Prize for his work in artificial intelligence. He's passionate about building intelligent systems that can interact with the world under uncertainty. We also have here, thank you very much, Dr. Saiph Savage. Dr. Savage is an assistant professor at Northeastern University in the College of Computer Sciences, where she's the director of the Civic AI Lab. Her research lab creates intelligent civic technology to organize collective action for real-world change. This includes fighting disinformation, empowering gig workers to access better jobs. So I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about her when it comes to the gig economy. And finally, we have Dr. Morgan Frank, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Informatics and Network Systems and the Department of Information, Culture, and Data Stewardship in the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh. That is the longest institution that I've ever had to say in my life. His research embraces complexities of artificial intelligence and its impact on the future of work. So thank you again, very distinguished panel. To start, I would like to give the floor to you, Dr. Enrique. You want to give a brief introduction and your points of view on AI and the workforce.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to share my screen.
Sure.
So I hope you can see now the presentation.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so as Andrés was saying, I am a research scientist at the National Institute for Astrophysics, Optics, and Electronics, that is in Puebla, Mexico. I have a PhD in computing from Imperial College, and I have been working for many years, basically in probabilistic graphical models, and more recently in causal reasoning and discovery. And I like, in general, applied work. I have worked in robotics, computer vision, energy, and biomedicine. And also recently started a startup, Aldawa Technologies, to try to get into the market a virtual rehabilitation system we develop. I'll tell you also a little bit about our institute. It's a national research laboratory that is located, as I said, in Puebla. We have departments of astrophysics, optics, electronics, and computer science, and around 150 researchers and 400 graduate students. So we have only graduate studies, master's and PhD level. And briefly, this is the main areas of research in our Department of Computer Science. We organize around these laboratories, and we have the master and PhD programs in computer science. So this is just a brief introduction. And maybe to start the discussion, I will share this table from some article a few years ago about the impact of automation in labor. Sorry, this is in Spanish, but here you can see in the left side some of the professions that are considered with high probability of being lost to automation, to AI, and on the right some of those that have a low probability. I think also this depends maybe on the country. For instance, in Mexico, I see difficult that construction workers, albañiles, can be automated soon, or even workers in agriculture. And the good news for us is that it seems like researchers in computer science have a low probability. So
that's good news. That's good news.
So thank you.
Thank you. I think now you can hear me. Thank you, Dr. Sucar, for that introduction. And yes, it is encouraging that we will have jobs, at least in the near future. Dr. Frank, Morgan Frank, I don't know if you want to give a brief introduction and your points of view on this, just on the general AI in the workforce.
Sure. So let me see here. Maybe I will also attempt sharing a screen. We'll see how this goes. Here we go. So can you see this slide here?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, great. So this is a schematic for how me and my collaborators have been thinking about labor markets, and in this case, the US labor market. Basically, if you want to understand how technology is shaping the future of work and which workers are most susceptible to automation and have to adapt their careers or adapt their skill set, we think you need to look at how different elements within the economy interact. So in particular, instead of looking at labor markets in isolation, you might look at the flow of workers and ideas and goods between different cities or different areas. If you want to understand any one labor market, you can, of course, look at the employment distribution to see what types of occupations are supported in that city. But these occupations, these employment opportunities, they don't really exist in isolation. People are moving in between these opportunities throughout their career. And what types of features determine this mobility, this career mobility? Well, one of the big things is what is a worker's skill set and what is their set of abilities? Now, these skills and abilities also tend to get bundled together. They're not usually in isolation. So for example, an economist might need programming skill and mathematical skill together, but maybe doesn't need physical strength and mathematics at the same time. So here, this schematic is what we've been starting with, and we believe that by investigating the empirical structure that describes each of these three layers and connecting these three layers into one giant multi-layered system, we can better understand how the specific skills and tasks that are automated by a technology, so say, for example, a computer vision algorithm diminishes the demand for some visual task, we can start to understand how these microscopic changes accumulate and diffuse into the macroscopic trends that we talk about more frequently today. So things like bottlenecks to career mobility, bottlenecks to spatial mobility, people trying to move to cities, and things like technological unemployment. Whose skills leave them most susceptible to complete automation, and who seems like they will instead be able to adapt their skill set moving forward. So this schematic is taken from a PNAS paper published with a lot of economists, computer scientists, urban scientists, and geographers. And I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff we're seeing by adopting this complex systems view.
That's pretty cool. It's sort of interesting to see once you have this built all of this graph and multi-layer effect. It would be very cool to see an animation of like how, you introduce some technology that automates somebody. How does that disperse across like the different labor force? I would love to see something like that.
Yeah, of course, that's the goal. As you know, it's a challenging problem.
Yes, of course. And then finally, Dr. Savage, same goes to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's such an honor to be here. I'm also going to quickly share my slides. Oh,
it's that little.
Oh, sorry.
The screen and a red. There you go. That's the one.
Okay. So, oh no, this is it. So, What I argue when we're thinking, so thank you all very much. I'm Dr. Savage. I'm currently at Northeastern University. I also collaborate closely with the National Autonomous University of Mexico and their Civic Innovation Lab. So some of the things that I'm considering when thinking about the future of work is, on one hand, I argue that we need platforms and tools through which we can audit what is happening inside the digital labor platforms. Because currently, these digital labor platforms are working as black boxes where we do not know what type of wages are workers being paid, what type of skill development are they facilitating, also what type of trajectories. For instance, right now, Dr. Morgan was talking a lot about, let's analyze the trajectories of workers to be able to make certain predictions. The problem is that within these digital labor markets, currently, it's very hard for us to understand what type of transitions are happening. So on one hand, I have been developing tools through which we can audit and quantify what's happening inside these digital labor markets. Through this, I uncovered that a large number of digital workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk were earning less than minimum wage. I recently have a new paper where I'm quantifying the amount of invisible labor that these workers are doing. We're finding that around 30% of the work that these digital workers have to do is invisible labor. Invisible labor is work for that workers have to complete, but for which they are not being paid. And so in order to bring change into these digital labor markets, we first have to audit and we first have to understand what is happening so that we can then create change. After I have understood it, I have then focused on designing systems through which I can guide workers in order to address some of the problems. So on one hand, I have been developing, for instance, tools like this one about Crowd Coach, where I'm guiding workers in order to develop their skills and increase their wages. And so here, for instance, I'm using simple reinforcement learning in order to guide workers to achieve their different goals. But right now, I would argue that within my research, we need to have auditing tools, and then we also once we understand the problem, we can then design new types of platforms. And I'm very much focused on designing with plugins. I integrate web plugins because that allows me to be able to stay within existing digital marketplaces, so workers don't have to download yet another app, but rather directly within the marketplace that they're in, they can use my web plugin in order to start to develop their skills or increase their wages. And well, thank you. And and also, yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Saiph. That was very informative, and actually touches a little bit about the first topic that we want to talk about, which is this gig economy crowdsourcing type of work, which is not necessarily AI, but it is definitely enabled by technology nowadays, which is something that it's a different type of work that, you know, it wasn't available in the 1980s, right? Like the word crowdsourcing I don't think it even existed. Even though maybe something similar to that, but not to the scale at which we have right now. So let me start by getting some questions out. And let's start with you, actually, Dr. Savage, since you finished talking. You know, the gig economy has, like I said, has grown very rapidly over the past decade. And it has brought a lot of flexibility to workers to create, you know, they can create their own schedule. It also, however, has made it easy for companies to sort of unofficially hire employees. You know, you strip them away from some benefits like healthcare because of this, right? I think a good example of this was Uber, I think last year or 2 years ago, that claimed that drivers were not part of their business models, right? Which sounds ridiculous, what Uber does. What do you see as, you know, the main advantages of the gig economy in society right now? What are the clear disadvantages, and how can we possibly try to overcome them?
So on one hand, I think it is important to realize that the gig economy is opening up a number of new jobs, and this can be especially important, for instance, in rural regions. So I've done a lot of work in understanding gig workers who come from rural regions. What benefits, what challenges are they facing? For a lot of rural employees, suddenly these digital labor markets become an opportunity for them to not have to leave their hometowns, but rather now they can stay in their hometowns and they can find work. And this is especially important given that we had a number of workers who had to abandon their towns, go into the cities. And so then you had suddenly a number of ghost towns. The gig economy is helping to change that. Another thing is, for instance, in rural regions, you also have a lot of single mothers. Gig work also offers you a lot of flexibility in terms of what times do you have to work. You can suddenly maybe take a break to attend to your children. And so gig work is providing certain flexibilities to people that traditional office jobs would not provide. Also with people with disabilities, we were finding that, for instance, the fact that some of the jobs were little in time and workers could do them in any type of setup that they had in their home was favorable for people who had certain chronic diseases where they had to be in a certain position to do the work. And also they had to take long breaks in order to attend their medical conditions. And so I think gig work on one hand is opening up a number of opportunities through its flexibility. However, this flexibility can also be evil. Why do I say that it can also be evil? Because companies are also tricking workers to start to believe that oh, you have all of the flexibility in the world. And then, for instance, in a recent paper that we have on invisible labor, we're seeing that workers are experiencing a number of hypervigilance, where they're not getting paid, but they're constantly, for instance, just waiting and searching for work. And so that was a type of task that companies used to pay workers for, and they are no longer paying workers for that type of tasks. And so in that type of flexibility, workers are now losing wages, and they're experiencing also a large stress. One of the things that we're arguing for is for personal labor spaces for workers so that we can help workers to better navigate this space. And I'll share our recent research paper on that topic. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Savage. That's very detailed. And I think, yes, I would love to have something where we can say, take most of the advantages of the gig economy, as you mentioned, but monitor everything that is happening with this invisible, which is the first time that I've heard about this, actually, this invisible labor that you're discussing. I would like to ask the same question to you, Morgan, and I want to hear your opinions.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that the many characteristics of the gig economy mirror the pros and cons of digital goods and the digital economy at large. So first, one of the great things about the gig economy is it becomes very easy to engage with anyone, anywhere in the world for many examples of gig work. So, one example, Uber drivers is spatially located, but another example of gig work is doing some of the data labeling required for the machine learning algorithms that are operating in today's big tech companies. And in principle, anyone can do a lot of this work. Anyone can label images for cats, would be the go-to example, of course. So this is a good thing because it means that the demand for work can be met by anyone, anywhere in the world, including people in developing countries. Some of the disadvantages that are part of this is that I worry some of this economic opportunity is actually a short-lived phenomenon. It's what's an example of what's called last mile jobs. And it's called last mile because we expect them. They complement technology as technology is today, but we know that technology is continuing to advance and may eventually completely automate away this type of work that still remains. So if we take image labeling as an example and machine learning, there's a ton of active research on what's called reinforcement learning, which is machine learning without labeled data. And if that frontier continues to advance, then there will be no need for the gig workers who are doing this crowdsourced data labeling. So this could be a really significant problem. Another disadvantage of the gig economy for these gig workers, especially those who are located away from the major employers of gig workers, is it's very hard for them to organize and to counteract the power of employers in this case. it's hard for workers who are spread out all over the world to create the social cohesion that's needed for something like a union or something like a body that can negotiate on the workers' behalf. And the final big issue that I see is that the developing countries are right now able to engage in the digital economy and the gig economy through things like crowdsourcing work. But I don't know that they're really reaping much of the economic rewards as a country, as an economy. So for example, Facebook and Google, these are companies that are located in well-to-do Western countries, and they may, for the moment, be sending some money out to these workers elsewhere in developing countries. But I think that these developing countries need to create some structure that allows them to capture some of that wealth and invest it into the infrastructure and educational system that will help send their local workers from being these dispensable gig workers to instead being on the frontier of what the future of the gig economy and the future of the digital economy might be.
That's very interesting. So you're suggesting something where we can, I don't know, tax the way that data moves back and forth between countries, so that if we are sending all of this information from US to a developing country to be labeled, the country should get something out of this, right?
Yes, so the devil's in the details, but I think there are a few options. One is to create some type of restriction to the flow of data or the use of data, where that restriction creates wealth generation for the country whose data or workers are being used. So GDPR is the predominant example today of governments putting controls on data usage. So you can imagine evolving something like GDPR to include some wealth generation that the government can use potentially to invest in their local communities. Another option that the employers of gig workers might prefer is if governments create some control over data usage and use it as an incentive for these companies to create educational programs that help gig workers advance their skill set and move away from being dispensable and instead being a more central worker with a more long-term role.
That would be cool. That would be very nice, actually. The next question that I want to touch is for you, Dr. Enrique Sucar. So, as we know, automation, and as you actually mentioned on your slides, automation is going to affect different jobs differently. The impact is not going to be the same for all jobs, and some types of jobs are more likely to be replaced than others. Do you think there are characteristics that we can use right now to predict which industries are going to be more affected by automation?
Yes, well, I think this table I show gives some idea, but I think in general, jobs that are more repetitive, for instance, manufacturing or some service jobs are the ones that have higher probability of being automated. And jobs like require more creativity, or even manual skills, because although there's a lot of research in robotics, I think we're still far for having machines that have the very good manual skills. So I think these jobs are less prone to automation. So I think in general terms, this could be the general characteristics of jobs that have a higher probability of being automated. And of course, a bit related with the previous comments, I think education is critical for this, especially in developing countries. So to train people to do other kinds of jobs that are less prone to automation.
Thanks. Actually, as a follow-up question on this, so we sort of discussed right now, there's the jobs that are going to be automated. There's the jobs that are going to survive automation. And I have a question for you again, Dr. Sucar. Like, there's also going to be somewhere in the middle. And I'm wondering if there's a way in which artificial intelligence is not just replacing people, but actually enhancing the way that they do their job. And how does that look?
Yes. I think AI can be helping or complementing a lot of professions. And I think a good example is medicine. So I want to share again my screen. So let me try this. So this is a very interesting book I have been reading recently, and basically says that all the challenges that medical doctors are confronting nowadays, a lot of the problems in bad diagnosis or the high cost of healthcare, and one solution is to have AI help these doctors so they can, as it says in the book, focus more on the human part and let the machine do more the technical aspects. So I'll read a couple of quotes from this book. One is, as machines get smarter and take on suitable tasks, humans might actually find it easier to be more human. Or so even now, the combined efforts and talents of humans and AI working synergistically can yield a medical triumph. So I think AI can enhance many areas like this one, like medical diagnosis, also in financial services, even in the law, in trials. So I think there's a big opportunity for AI, not to take out jobs, but to complement jobs and make them more fulfilling for the people that are doing it, and for the recipients of these services, like patients.
I think that's a good example of how AI is enhancing jobs. I'm aware of something at Google where they were working a lot with retinopathy images so that they could detect retinopathy faster and easier, I guess, while you still obviously need the help of a doctor to do full diagnosis and treatment, right? So this was a good example. I would love to hear also same question for you, Saiph, if you can give us your opinion.
Yeah, so we have been looking into the type of tasks that, for instance, should be delegated to AI in order so that the human worker can focus on more creative tasks. I share right now in the chat an AI-based interface that we have been developing with Mexico's federal government, where government employees are using virtual assistants to delegate boring tasks, for instance, responding to repetitive questions about what time will, let's say, the embassy open, where can I find this certain document, and so the government employee can delegate those tasks to an AI-based virtual assistant, and this way the government employee can focus on more complex questions that citizens might have, where they're using their creativity, more of human reasoning. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity in, as Dr. Sucar mentioned, having humans focus on more creative tasks. We have also been looking into AI tools through which we can guide workers to start to develop certain skills. So the AI starts to recommend each time more and more complex tasks, considering that many times when you lose people is because they might receive a very daunting task that can completely take them out of the workforce because they're not able to complete it. And so what we're doing is that we have breakdown of tasks that are guiding them to develop certain skills.
Great, thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit and ask more of a historical question right now. So this is directed to you, Morgan. This is, this is referred to as the fourth industrial revolution, right? The technology revolution, and how is this going to affect labor? It's not new of all of the other industrial revolutions, right? In the first industrial revolution, people were afraid that they were going to lose their jobs and they were going to be automated away by the textile machines, and they were roughly a lot of people got fired, and then there was a very painful period of time where a lot of people lost their jobs, and then eventually we sort of found a new equilibrium. I'm wondering if you see this fourth industrial revolution to be very different from other sort of technological innovations that have happened through time, and if it is different, like how different is it going to be, or why is it different?
Sure. So yeah, this is a really great question. I agree completely that the exciting machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies that we're most prone to talk about today, they're still just technologies. And so in some sense, they aren't so dissimilar from technological advances of the past. And if we look historically, we've continuously innovated throughout all of history, and yet we still have a growing global economy. Many things are improving globally, including health incomes, and up until the COVID pandemic, employment in many countries was at an all-time high. With history in mind, I think there's good reason to be optimistic. However, a lot of these statistics, especially really aggregating statistics like total employment, they can really miss a lot of this transition period and a lot of the pain that happens during transitions from, for example, the implementation and adoption of new technology. And so I think this is really the sticking point here for AI technologies. So sure, technology has existed in the past and has automated workers, but the types of workers who are exposed to these new technologies and the types of tasks that are automated by machine learning and by computer vision and so on, they're really very different. It's this whole other part of the economy and of the space of potential workers' skills that's now under attack. And so the usual infrastructure for helping workers in these who might be displaced because of these technologies, it doesn't really exist. So one example of this is you can think about in the US, in the past, not so much now, but in the past, unions were a really big part of manufacturing work and for many of the very physical industries. And similar unions don't really exist in many of the other more cognitive sectors of the economy. And they still don't really exist today. So unions are one thing that helped manufacturing workers move between employment opportunities, in part because they could collectively bargain, and also because employers had agreements with unions that made it easier for them to hire union workers. And these similar type of thing doesn't exist officially today, and may be something, the type of institution and the type of infrastructure that can produce a really painful transition for AI technologies.
I think that's interesting, and I believe unions roughly started because of this, right? At the end, we started getting so much disposable workforce that it just became too much, and the balance tipped, and so we sort of decided that unions are necessary, and maybe we are approaching this tipping point where crowdsourced workers are not getting anything, and they're being exploited, and we have this invisible labor that we're not really compensating in the way that they should be compensated. So maybe this is how we start building the unions in this new era, after the fourth industrial revolution, right? Maybe this is the time.
Yeah, I think Professor Savage might have a lot to say about those.
No, I want to mention it. It resonated a lot to me. What you guys were mentioning about looking into history to also help guide us. I have been learning a lot actually by understanding how unions function and how they negotiate. So, for instance, one big thing that unions play with is the branding of big companies. So, for instance, farmer workers, when they want to raise their salaries, they go with the big company that's hiring, for instance, the big farms from which they're from, because they know that Wendy's will not want to have news reports about them paying less than minimum wage. And so that's in part why what motivated me as well to start to develop these plugins, because the plugins offer us a way in which I've been developing plugins through which we can audit digital labor platforms and quantify what is happening inside them. My hope is that workers can then use these types of plugins to connect with news reporters or policymakers and showcase like, hey, let's say maybe over 10,000 workers use the plugin and we're all earning less than minimum wage. We're earning around $2 per hour. That's a big thing. And so I think that we need these types of tools in order to help workers to negotiate. And I think that looking at the history of unions, we can learn a lot about the type of tool design that we should think about.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up to the public to ask questions, and we have a couple of them. Thank you, Morgan, for you being very active in the chat, replying to some of this in the background. I think one of these questions is actually very relevant to what we just were discussing. Maybe Dr. Enrique or Dr. Saiph, who are more familiar with the Mexican landscape, can take this one. Unlike the US, actually Mexico has very strong worker unions. They are, I would say, very powerful. How do you see these worker unions transforming the work, the digital work, the future of digital work? And either one of you two might want to take this question.
Maybe I'll leave it to Saiph.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of actually great opportunities in learning about how workers in Mexico organize. For instance, I actually don't know, for instance, if also Morgan was aware, but Mexico also has a number of worker cooperatives. And so I think that it's going to be helpful to understand in more detail how these worker unions, how these worker cooperatives have evolved, how they're operating, and then start to think about how we can use those learnings in the tool designs that we're doing. So, for instance, a big worker cooperative is Boing. So we had some juices, which I'll share a link, which is just completely run by workers, and the workers who are on that platform are earning really good earnings. And so I think that it's going to be helpful to look at those success stories that Mexico does have, and then start to think about how we can redesign. And I also like what they mentioned about that. That's going to be the future of digital platforms. We don't have to think that the future has to be again like maybe one big company that's maybe abusing workers, but rather we have the power to define positive futures.
Thank you for that point of view. Another question comes here. Maybe it's not entirely related to AI, but it is related to the way that technology workers work right now. So the question is, speaking of history, a number of tech workers experience burnout. How is the burnout that workers are experiencing now different / similar than the burnout they experienced in the past? I don't know if you are familiar with how tech workers are experiencing burnout at the moment.
Yeah, so this is an area of research that a lot of business and management researchers are focusing on for the office workers who are working with technology and working with machine learning. But I think, and I can't comment on all of that research, but what I see from my perspective is that these workers are, especially gig workers, they are kind of spread out. I mentioned this earlier, and this can create some isolation. People really need communities, not just in their social settings, but also in their work settings. For example, many people really identify with their occupation. And that's something that they would use to describe themselves. I am a professor. I am a doctor. I am an Uber driver. And so when you sort of take away the community and the weight of that label, you can create this loneliness and this hopelessness, because it's difficult for you to leverage your social network within your working community to find new opportunities or to feel like you're moving and you're part of something. So, imagine being an academic and there being no conferences at all, no Zoom calls, no meetings. You're just by yourself doing research. It wouldn't really work. And I think that this is an issue for many gig workers because they're so spread out.
And I can only imagine the pandemic just makes this much, much, much worse. I mean, I think we've all been, or at least lets us know a little bit like how this feels. Right now, we've been all isolated for 2 years, doing only Zoom calls. So this definitely is composing. I don't know if anybody else wants to take a chance at replying this question.
Yeah, I agree. This is also why I was a little careful too, because there's a lot of research about COVID economy burnout that I think is requires careful consideration.
Yeah, I shared a website that has been helpful for me to understand, for instance, burnout for tech workers. I was recently actually working in big tech, and so that was, I think, very helpful for me as well to understand the type of burnout that might be existing currently with tech workers. And I don't know, Andrés, actually, if you, because I know that you also work in big tech, I don't know if you want to share your experiences with burnout. My experience is that burnout sometimes is felt, especially when the workers or you yourself lack control over certain decisions. And so, for instance, you might be working very hard in X or Y, and then suddenly the whole thing that you input as work is not taken into account. And where you especially feel that you don't have control over what will happen to you is where you feel burnout. And so, for instance, those stories from Amazon workers, a lot of them are lack of control, and I think that's what's triggering their burnout. And so, I think that there it's helping workers to negotiate with the employers in order for them to have fair workspaces and have more control over their own labor.
Yeah, thank you. And I do agree with you. I've seen it happening a lot at where I work I work at Google. So I've seen the burnout happening when you're sort of working, as you say. You can work for a month on something, and then it just happens to be that work actually was not taken into account at all at the end for whatever decision process. I think it's a problem that affects very big companies, right? Because there's so much distance between the person that is making the decision and the person that is doing all of the actual work, right? The person that is taking all of the coding responsibilities and all of the research responsibilities. So when there is that much distance, I don't think that's necessarily just for tech. I think that's probably true of every big or extremely large company, and just happens to be that tech right now is what are those extremely large companies. So I wanted to get one last question in, I guess, for the three of you, if we have time. I was wondering on whether you have any thoughts on how to design policy that is robust against job displacement due to AI. Like, is there something that countries, governments can do to help ease this pain of transitioning to a more automated world? And I think I'll start with you, Dr. Sucar, since you are unmuted.
Sure. Yes, I think governments can have a big part. I think especially in countries like Mexico or developing countries. And I'm thinking of two aspects. I think one critical one is education. So people are prepared for these new kind of opportunities of jobs, starting from basic education. So in our computer science academy, we have been promoting this of computational thinking, of trying to think these computer abilities to young kids to be prepared for the future. And so in general, I think education and also like re-education is critical to, so this as Morgan said, this transition phase doesn't affect so much people. And the other aspect, I think in Mexico and also developing countries is trying to promote more research and development, and in particular, how to get research into technology and to create companies, because otherwise I feel in countries like Mexico, we are going to lose a lot of jobs. For instance, in all the manufacturing industry that is operating in Mexico, this maybe with robots in the future, it will be not so attractive to look for cheap labor. But we have the disadvantages, but not the advantages of the new companies, the new technology that creates also a lot of jobs. So developing this new technology, having companies in Mexico that also work in this area, I think was also critical.
I tend to agree very much with you, Dr. Sucar. I've been thinking about this on the way that Mexico is seen, especially from the U.S. perspective, as a very cheap labor for manufacturing things. That's the reason why there's so many car manufacturers in Mexico. It's because it's so much cheaper to build them here than to build them in the U.S. Right? And you're right. We haven't gotten the part where like, oh well, maybe let's move some jobs that are like more technology oriented. I think Mexico has great coders, has great engineers, and somehow that shift we haven't seen that shift yet, where a lot of technology gets developed here in Mexico, right? I think you make a great point there.
Exactly, and this cheap labor advantage can disappear in the future,
right.
And
Absolutely.
then we'll be in big trouble.
Right. Dr. Savage, you want to take the question on what governments can do and what policy can be developed?
Yeah, one big thing that right now I'm aiming to do is I think that we need to ensure that it is not penalized, the creation of plugins through which we can quantify what is happening inside these digital labor platforms. So right now, for instance, the term of services are allowing us to create plugins through which I'm able to quantify different types of interactions that are happening inside these digital labor platforms. I'm very worried that, for instance, once we start better exposing what is happening inside these platforms and these big tech companies start to get backlash, that they'll start to penalize the use of these type of transparency tools. So I think that on one hand, we do need to fight to ensure that these types of transparency tools are not penalized. Similar to what has recently happened with web crawling, where there has been a lot of fighting to ensure that web crawling is not penalized. I think that it's critical that we provide transparency to these digital labor platforms so that we can understand what is happening, so that then policymakers can make changes.
That's a very good point, and let's hope that this doesn't happen. Unfortunately, I'm a very cynical person, and I think you're right. Like once you start reporting on this, that's the first thing that big companies will do, will be to try to block this somehow. But let's hope that it doesn't happen. And then finally, Dr. Frank, I'll leave the last question to the last response to you.
Sure, thanks. So I think that policy can really improve on this front. A lot of the responses I'm seeing from policymakers in the US don't sound feasible at all. They sound really naive. So things like autonomous vehicles might mature in the next few decades. That would really hurt demand for, say, truck drivers, which is the most common job title in the US, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's a lot of people you would need to shift into other types of work. Some of the policy I'm seeing that is being proactive about this says, well, demand for programmers is going up. We'll just teach people Python. Python tutorials are available online for free. It should be really easy and cheap. But this completely misses the bundle of skills and abilities that are required to be an effective software developer. So in addition to knowing Python coding syntax, you need some numeracy skills, you need some basic math, and so on. You also need to be able to work on a team effectively with other programmers who might have other proficiencies from you. And being able to work on a team like that is that's a skill set all to itself that I think is best learned with experience. So the other responses I'm seeing are, well, think about what the complements are. So this is like the classic creative destruction narrative of technological change, where if autonomous vehicle, part of autonomous vehicles, part of the promise is that an autonomous vehicle can run 24/7, stopping only to refuel and to change what it's carrying. And that means that each vehicle is going to spend more time on the road and was likely to need more repairs. I could imagine if autonomous trucking was a really mature thing, that there would be a lot of demand for mechanics. And maybe truck drivers have a closer skill set to what's required to be a mechanic. So maybe truck drivers could meet this growth of demand for truck mechanics. However, we know that mechanics today, it's kind of just barely an example of what economists and policy folks would call a good job, a job where you can support a family and send your kid to college and have a mortgage and eventually retire. And what we're seeing with a lot of these last mile jobs and a lot of these jobs that experience increased employment as they complement technology is that they are not good jobs. So we need some more targeted policy that focuses on exactly what displaced workers have for skills and what new skills are going to be most in demand and most achievable for these workers. And this is a really nuanced question. It's really hard to study, in part because it sort of does away with a lot of the way economists usually approach these problems, where you simplify things as much as possible. The other thing is we don't have extremely good data on this. My research relies a lot on this very aggregated skill taxonomy data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But if we could actually put measurement devices in the workplace, that would be the best. I don't think that companies will be very open to this, perhaps because of backlash from the community, but also because this exposes their secret sauce. It exposes their processes, and this is how companies make money. So I think this is a really challenging thing to overcome. Policymakers can do more to support and develop more targeted reskilling and upskilling policy. And I think that companies can be more proactive about measuring what their workers are doing and creating institutions and safe ways to share that detailed data with researchers who can actually help them save money by keeping their workers appropriately skilled for the future of work, rather than having to onboard new workers every time there's a big shift.
Thank you. Although you're the privacy researcher in me, just cringes a little bit at the mention of let's track what everybody does and work and share it with other people.
So let me say, I deeply appreciate the privacy concern. So it should all be done in balance, of course.
Yep. Well, we have 2 minutes, and I just wanted to thank the three of you again for coming. I thought this was a very interesting discussion, very interesting point of view from US, from Mexico, and from somewhere in the middle of US and Mexico. So again, thank you for everyone.